I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Russia reportedly tests thermobaric munitions on ground-based drones, we turn to the World Economic Forum in Davos, where world leaders have gathered for what was meant to be a week of diplomatic breakthroughs for Kyiv. Instead, the agenda has been hijacked by President Trump and his threats over Greenland. We hear the latest from the ground there before speaking to the author of a new report on Russian cyber warfare.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 20th of January, 3 years and 332 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, dialing in from Greenland, and Michael McManus of the Henry Jackson Society think tank. But first, the latest military updates from Dom.
Let's start in Ukraine. Now, we reported yesterday about concerns expressed by the International Atomic Energy Agency that was saying Russian strikes had damaged electricity substations feeding Ukraine's nuclear power stations. Well, overnight, they've all been hit again. A massive attack last night across the country caused widespread death and injury and triggered a lot of outages of electricity, water, heating. Local authorities across the country in pretty much all regions are saying. Now, the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, said that as a result of last night's attacks, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant has, quote, lost all off-site power, and power lines to other Ukrainian nuclear plants were also impacted. Now, Director General Rothwell said the IAEA is actively following developments in order to assess impact on nuclear safety. That sounds a little bit, well, I mean, it sounds calm and ordered, which is, I hope, appropriate. If nuclear power plants are in danger of being hit, I wonder if that's too much of an understatement. Anyway, we'll see what else he has to say in the IAEA report. So as a result of these attacks last night, 60% of Kyiv was without power at one point this morning. Ukraine's largest private energy company, DTEK, said that more than 335,000 people lost electricity in the capital. As of just a few hours ago, power has been restored to 162,000 homes, leaving 173,000 without power. That's homes, not people, 173,000. So last night, over 300 drones plus 18 ballistic and 15 cruise missiles were fired at Kyiv and the wider Kyiv Oblast. Also Vinnytsia, Dnipro, Odessa, Zaporizhia, Poltava and Sumy. Ukrainian authorities say repair crews and the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, plus all necessary forces, are engaged everywhere. The Air Force says that all bar 6 missiles were shot down and 315 drones also brought down. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andrei Sybiha said Putin's barbaric strike this morning is a wake-up call to world leaders gathering in Davos. Support for the Ukrainian people is urgent. There will be no peace in Europe without a lasting peace for Ukraine. Peace can only be achieved through strength. We need urgent additional energy assistance, air defence and interceptors, as well as sanctions pressure on Moscow. Now, although substations connected to Ukraine's nuclear power plants were targeted, Moscow failed to disconnect the plants entirely. So says Vitaly Zychenko, who's the chief exec of Ukraine's state grid operator Ukrenergo. He was speaking to our colleagues and friends at the Kyiv Independent. Describing protection around the substations as good, Mr. Zychenko said, the Russians were not successful. We were successful. The substations connect two nuclear plants, one in the western part and the other in the south, connecting to Ukraine's energy grid. Now, the country's 3 operating nuclear power plants are its main source of electricity generation as the country obviously battles the ongoing sub-zero conditions. Ukraine's MOD said the day before this strike, we finally received the necessary missiles which helped significantly. Every support package matters. Missiles for Patriots, NASAMS and other air defence systems are critically needed. The direct task of our entire diplomatic system is to ensure that Ukraine has sufficient air defence capabilities. Now, Russian forces also cynically, in Ukraine's words, cynically struck civilian infrastructure in southern Odessa Oblast, targeting residential areas and energy facilities there, according to Regional Governor Ole Keeper. He was speaking this morning. As well as that, the western Oblast of Rivne, there the Regional Governor Alexander Koval said that more than 10,000 people were without power after the attacks. And then in Vinnytsia Oblast, that's one to the southwest of the wider Kyiv region, Russian forces hit an energy facility there, but no one was injured, so says Regional Governor Natalia Zobolotna. Energy facilities damaged in Kharkiv as well. The local mayor there, Ihor Terekov, said that Russia has intensified missile strikes on local energy infrastructure in recent days, often hitting the same targets repeatedly. And then right in the centre of the country, Dnipro Mayor Boris Filatov said that hundreds of homes in his region had also been left without heating. President Zelensky cancelled his trip to, or at least his departure for, the World Economic Forum in Davos as a result. Instead, he held an emergency meeting this morning with Ukraine's energy and defence officials to assess the damage and coordinate the response. He said the most difficult situation remained in Kyiv, parts of the wider Kyiv Oblast and Kharkiv. The strike on energy infrastructure left huge numbers of people in Kyiv and the surrounding region, as well as Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Sumy, Rivne and Kharkiv Oblast totally without power, the Energy Ministry confirmed. Now, elsewhere across the country, Ukraine's General Staff this morning said that they'd hit a Russian drone warehouse in occupied Luhansk Oblast, the strike happening on Sunday night. The site in Novokrasnyanka, that's a village in occupied Luhansk Oblast, about 50 km northeast of Kramatorsk, belonged to Russia's 144th Motorized Rifle Division, Kyiv said. Also, Ukraine's security service, the SBU, say they've captured a Russian soldier who allegedly shot and killed 9 Ukrainian prisoners of war in Kursk Oblast in October 2024. Announcing the news last night, President Zelensky said, "We will find every Russian murderer. Every single one will be held accountable." A couple more things from me. Russia is reportedly testing the use of thermobaric missiles on ground drones. So Ukraine's online media outlet Militani says Russian engineers have integrated the 220mm guide rails from the TOS-1 Alpha Solin-Tsepyok heavy flamethrower into a ground drone. So footage of the tests of the new system appeared yesterday on the Ukrainian Telegram channel called Vodogray. Russia has named the system Malvina M. If so, it's going to be the first Russian ground drone equipped with thermobaric weapons. I also saw some reporting on this from the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank. They say thermobaric weapons, which are also known as vacuum or aerosol bombs, are a specialised type of explosive munition that generates a significant overpressure in the explosion as well as extreme heat by dispersing and then igniting an aerosol cloud of explosives which sucks out all the surrounding oxygen. Traditional thermobaric systems are used against fortified structures such as bunkers or buildings. Like I say, they take all the oxygen out, create a huge overpressure, so blasting the building apart many meters away from where the actual missile went in. Russia's principal thermobaric launcher is the TOS-1 Alpha. We've seen a few of them be used and hit in Ukraine. That's a large, expensive, pretty slow-moving vehicle on a tank chassis. It only has a short range, such that it requires Russian forces to get close to the front line to use them, obviously then susceptible to Ukraine's drones. Now, Russia's integration of thermobaric artillery onto ground-based drones could allow Russia to conceal and then launch them much closer to the front line in an attempt to mitigate factors that degrade the effectiveness of the tank-based TOS-1. Anyway, I'll put a link in the episode notes for you to have a look at that thing, but that is a development to keep an eye on. And then just finally, we have obviously wondered for some time what stance Czechia is going to take regarding continued support for Ukraine after the election of Andrej Babiš as Prime Minister last year. Well, we might now have an answer. So despite Czech President Petr Pavel supporting the proposal for the Czech Republic to sell some of its fleet of L-159 light combat aircraft to Ukraine, Mr. Babiš has stepped in to stop it. So President Petr Pavel visited Ukraine last week, and he said on Sunday that selling 4 out of the Czech military's 24 L-159 jets would not endanger its defence capabilities, as in Czechia's defence capabilities. Plus, he said Kyiv's offer to buy the planes would be an opportunity for the Czech defence industry. Mr. Babiš thought differently. With comments on Czech TV, having just had a government meeting, he said Defence Minister Jaromír Zuna believed the aircraft still have a service life of about 15 years, quote, and that the army needs them. Responding to that, Petr Pavel said, I'm afraid that with this decision, we are moving closer to selfishness rather than solidarity. So not all going well between the President and the new Prime Minister in the Czech Republic. But that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks very much, Dom. Selfishness rather than solidarity rather captures the zeitgeist, doesn't it, really? Today was supposed to be a big one for the Ukrainians as the World Economic Forum in Davos properly gets underway. The expectation being, until the crisis erupted over the fate of Greenland, building on the momentum of the peace talks before Christmas, that Ukraine and her allies might be able to persuade President Trump to formally agree the sketched out security guarantees and prosperity deal for Kyiv this week. Now, while the documents are still on the table and Kyiv has a delegation on standby in Switzerland, almost all of the talk so far, on stage and behind it, has been focused on Greenland and the future of the transatlantic alliance. That in and of itself is, of course, a success for Moscow, who, many hoped, perhaps over-optimistically, might find themselves faced with a fait accompli, a peace plan they would have to either accept or reject. Now, despite millions freezing in their homes in recent weeks and more barbaric attacks Ukrainians are enduring daily, their fate has become something of a sideshow compared to the big show at Davos, something acknowledged by President Zelensky himself by choosing to stay in Ukraine. So far, he said, my plan is to help our people during the energy crisis. This is the priority for me. I chose Ukraine and not the economic forums. But everything might change any minute. There's 1 mile left to finalise the documents. If they are ready, we will have a meeting. If we have energy aid packages, meetings on additional air defence, I will definitely go. Now, the main speeches have only just begun, with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen speaking out already against President Trump's threats. Plunging us into a dangerous downward spiral, she said, would only aid the very adversaries we are both so committed to keeping out of our strategic landscape. So our response will be unflinching, united and proportional. She went on, Greenland's sovereignty is non-negotiable. It is for sovereign people to decide their own future. But that concept of self-determination, a staple of American foreign policy for decades, seems alien to Trump, who yesterday escalated his verbal attacks on his so-called allies. First, by posting doctored images of him lecturing European leaders next to a map showing America controlling the entirety of Canada, and another AI-generated image of him, Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, planting an American flag on Greenland. But that was just the start. In a huge breach of diplomatic convention, Trump once again started posting screenshots of private messages to him from world leaders. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte's is straight from his playbook up until this point. He says, Mr. President, dear Donald, what you accomplished in Syria today is incredible. I will use my media engagements in Davos to highlight your work there, in Gaza and in Ukraine. I am committed to finding a way forward on Greenland. Can't wait to see you. Yours, Mark. He doesn't call him Daddy this time, but it's not far off, is it? President Macron of France also adopts flattery in his shared message. Now, I'm not going to read all of it, but he says, my friend, we're totally in line on Syria. We can do great things on Iran. I do not understand what you are doing on Greenland, but let's build great things. Let's set up a G7 meeting after Davos in Paris on Thursday. I can invite the Ukrainians, the Danish, the Syrians, and the Russians in the margins. Let's have dinner together in Paris before you go back. Emmanuel. What isn't clear from Trump's end is what his intention is by sharing these. To draw attention to his so-called achievements flagged by these leaders in their texts, or to humiliate them by showing their apparent sycophancy. We don't know, but there's no such uncertainty over Trump's social media post attacking the British. He's gone full tilt, as it were, in attacking the position over the Chagos Islands. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all of the details of that ongoing saga, but Trump said this: shockingly, our brilliant NATO ally, the UK, is currently planning to give away the island of Diego Garcia, the site of a vital US military base, to Mauritius, and to do so for no reason whatsoever. There is no doubt that China and Russia have noticed this act of total weakness. These are international powers who only recognise strength, which is why the United States of America under my leadership is now, after only 1 year, respected like never before. The UK giving away extremely important land is an act of great stupidity and is another in a very long line of national security reasons why Greenland has to be acquired. Denmark and its European allies have to do the right thing. Thank you for your attention to this matter, etc., etc. Now, as I say, I'm not going to go into all of the saga over Chagos. We'd be here half an hour, but I just draw attention to this, not just because of what it means for UK-US relations, but because it shows the value, or not, as the case may be, of agreements made by Trump. This is a complete reversal of his previous support, made publicly, for the UK's Chagos Islands deal. And if we extrapolate that out, how can any deal, say, for example, on security guarantees on Ukraine, be worth the paper it's written on? The dilemma faced by not just Downing Street, but European leaders more broadly, is how best to handle this precarious moment. Is it to continue with this strategy of trying to placate Trump, or is it time to push back? Francis Fukuyama, yes, of the end of history fame, has a clear answer. He said yesterday, as an American, I have one thing to say to my many European friends: do not back down in this confrontation. Up to now, both the EU and the major European powers have sought to appease Trump by offering him concessions, flattery, personal gifts and other forms of tribute. This strategy has not worked and should be abandoned immediately. Trump is fundamentally a bully who wants to dominate everyone around him. To placate him with concessions is a fool's errand. He despises weakness and those who display it. Last spring, the EU cut a trade deal with him that accepted a 15% tariff on all European goods with no retaliation. This was a bad decision. The EU should have taken a common position and retaliated. What makes any European think that conceding Greenland will mollify Trump? He will simply come back for more later. Europeans should keep in mind that those countries that stood up to Trump's threats in 2025, which include China, India and Brazil, all did well and did not have to succumb. Domestic support for their leaders increased, and in China's case, the US became much more cooperative. Now, Fukuyama is not alone in saying that today, but given the European dependence on the US for its defence, many capitals are more likely to opt out and choose a more cautious approach. Though, of course, what may seem cautious now may be seen as reckless in a few days, at least a few weeks' time. As we've said so many times on the podcast, seeking to appease Trump in this past year while buying time to rearm and recalibrate, it would have been uncomfortable, but it wouldn't necessarily have been foolhardy. But only choosing appeasement, if that's the term we should use now, surely was and still is. Now, seemingly not content with Greenland, Trump seems to have set his sights on rebuilding a new rules-based order outside of the United Nations. His Gaza Peace Board has expanded to a bigger board of peace, featuring countries he says he wants to do business with. As we said yesterday, Putin has been invited to be on that board, and we've learned in the past hour that so has Zelensky. He has acknowledged that, saying, though, that Russia is our enemy. Belarus is their ally. It's hard for me, this being Zelensky, to imagine how we could sit with Russia in any council. And this isn't about the Peace Council. Russia stands for war. So far in Europe, surprise, surprise, only Hungary's Viktor Orban has agreed to be on that panel. But it's almost impossible to see how the UK or any other European nation will agree to sit on anything with Putin there. The major question perhaps of today, though, and we won't hear for at least another few hours, is whether Congress will try and tie Trump's hands and limit his strategy of using global tariffs as a foreign policy weapon. The historian Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic wrote yesterday how because the people around Trump aren't stopping him, they seem too corrupt or too power hungry, she says, that leaves Republicans in Congress as the last barrier. They owe it to the American people, she writes, and to the world to stop Trump from acting out his fantasy in Greenland and doing permanent damage to American interests. But the question is, will they? And if they don't, who will speak out against this madness? But let's hear an update now from our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, who's just landed in Greenland. Well, James, we spoke to you yesterday as you were literally packing a suitcase for Greenland. You've now arrived. First of all, have you managed to get accommodation? You weren't tempted by a Winnebago?
Hello, Francis. I'm happy to report that a Winnebago was not necessary yet, at least, on this trip. Jeff, our highly capable photographer, has been able to find us some accommodation because it is, as you would expect, and our listeners would expect, a very, very small town of 20,000 people that's just had the world's international media descend upon it. So there's no room at the inn. The hotels are fully booked. There's a long queue for taxis when you get out at the airport. It's the type of fishing town, fishing village style experience that's very well equipped for a little bit of tourism in tourism seasons. But beyond that, it's obviously not a place that was designed for huge amounts of media people turning up all at once. And so there's a very, very palpable sense in the air, or an almost palpable sense, I should say, that this place has been kind of thrust once again back into the international spotlight. And of course, our job for the next couple of days is going to be going out and speaking to Greenlanders and hearing more for their perspective. We hear a lot from Copenhagen, we hear a lot from Washington, but what we're here to do, of course, is speak to people in Nuuk and get their perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll make sure that you prepare for long queues in the bars. I imagine it's going to be a bit tricky later on if you get much time for any of that. But James, I know obviously you've been travelling in the air today. It's always a stressful thing to do that. So I'm not expecting that you're up to date on all of the latest on this, but I'd be really interested to hear your take on the latest on Greenland. I know that some of the politicians there have made a few statements today.
Yes, that's right, Francis. I think the main thing to touch on today is the Greenlandic Prime Minister. He gave a statement earlier today, which I think was largely designed to reassure Greenlanders. But it did say that the possibility of the United States resorting to military force cannot be ruled out. Jens Frederik Nielsen said, I'm quoting him now, Francis, it's unlikely that there'll be a military coup, but he said it cannot be ruled out. I've also seen some reports in Danish media reporting the contents of that speech, saying that there was a suggestion that Greenlanders might need to resort to contingency planning, such as storing up 5 days of food. Now, I think the goal of that speech was just to try and, I think, basically provide a little bit of reassurance to the population over here. But it's that slightly worrying subordinate clause, but it cannot be ruled out, in reference to the threat of US military action that, of course, inevitably will lead to concern. And at the same time, everyone is watching the Davos summit very, very quickly. One senior US official I saw told reporters over there, Mr. Trump's comments on Greenland are expected to be quite harsh later. So I think there's a lot of anticipation over here.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one final question, James, because I know that he barely just landed, to be fair. You spoke there about the fear that Greenlanders feel about the language there is strong. In terms of what, in the worst case scenarios of some sort of attempted coup, military operation or whatever, it doesn't have to be, does it, that there would be lots of warning necessarily? It wouldn't be that American Armada would be on the shores of Greenland and waiting to strike. This could be something that would be done quite quickly in extremis, and that's part of the reason for the concern.
Yes, that's correct. This is obviously completely uncharted territory. We're talking about a hypothetical situation where the US takes military action against one of its own allies on the pretext of a security concern, namely, quote, Russian and Chinese ships being all over the place, a pretext that doesn't exist, according to the Danes. Nevertheless, if it happened, the experts that I've spoken to have said that one way that this could happen, and they are obviously speculating too, could potentially be as straightforward as soldiers or a new leadership, if you like, as part of an American coup, just crossing the road, figuratively speaking, in Nuuk, going from the US consulate building over to the government building. That's one scenario that's been suggested to me. Of course, we are talking about the President of the United States, one of, if perhaps the most unpredictable presidents in the history of that country. And I suppose one question that people might be asking themselves bearing in mind what happened in Venezuela very recently, which was a very, very complex, advanced mission that was designed to kind of dazzle, to some extent, the American public. One might wonder if deep in the bowels of the Department of Defense, something along those lines, something that's very, very kinetic, something that's very attention-grabbing, something that's going to be really commanding the airwaves, which we know is something that the president likes to do. One could, of course, speculate that that might be there as well. But I just want to stress this, Francis, that I'm really, really speculating on that at the moment. It's an area that I hope to become much, much better informed on after a few days reporting out here. But based on those chats that I've had so far with, as I said, mainly Danish security experts, yes, that kind of thing is what's kind of circulating.
Yeah, well, it certainly tallies with some of the conversations that we've been having here in London as well. So, yeah, very concerning times. Well, James, I know that you've got to get on and unpack rather than packing this time. Thank you very much for taking the time to dial in to us today. We'll, of course, be citing your reporting over the course of the week and look forward to having you on again, and good luck out there.
Thanks, Francis. Much appreciated, and all best. Bye-bye.
Now let's move away from Greenland, despite its significance for the war in Ukraine, and focus on Russia's expanding hybrid warfare operations in Europe. As we all know from Russian propaganda, Britain is often public enemy number one. Remember when that guy told us to go and pray for our moss-covered queen? I still don't know what he means by that. And to go and eat porridge, which, to be fair, is an insult. As you know, I hate porridge, with no disrespect to our Swedish listeners. I do still have that porridge recipe book sent to me by an angry listener. But we're going to look in more detail about why Britain is such a target and how that is manifesting itself in the digital cyber realm. We're joined by Michael McManus of the Henry Jackson Society. Michael, welcome. Thank you for your time today. We're talking about a new report that you've authored for Henry Jackson into Russian cyber warfare against Ukraine and NATO, and particularly the United Kingdom. It's a really interesting report, and of course we're going to link to it in the show notes. The UK was the 6th most targeted NATO country by Russia, but the numbers are pretty staggering. So there was a 1,586% increase in a single year after the full-scale invasion in terms of the attacks on the United Kingdom. And there's lots of granular detail that you've sourced here based on the material available publicly in open source and also other places, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first of all, I just wanted to ask a little bit about why the Russians are seemingly so good at cyber warfare relative to certain other powers. Why is there that latent expertise?
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. In terms of why Russia is so skilled in this area, a lot of it is their Soviet history, because in the past they had a very advanced space program, a very advanced missile program. These things require technical expertise in mathematics and science. And what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed is you ended up with an oversized percentage of the population with backgrounds in mathematics and science. Now, these are the foundational disciplines you would need for computer science. And the end of the Cold War coincided almost perfectly with the rise of the digital age. So what you then had was a situation where the Russians said, well, if we want to be a player in warfare going forward now, it's not so much about satellites in space or missiles in silos. It's our ability to hack the opponent, interfere with his communications, and leverage our well-trained population to achieve that aim.
It's very interesting. So how did you, first of all, calculate the attacks that have been registered by others? How did you bring it all together? Well, there's multiple ways of measuring it, and different open source organisations have different methodologies. But the one that we went with was the Cyber Peace Institute, which is an organisation that has data, quite detailed data, on cyber attacks by the country of origin, the country that's being attacked, the type of cyber attack that's being used, the sector of the economy, and also a series over time. And it was interesting because the data they had is for 2022 and 2023. And we thought that was an interesting period anyway, because in 2022, the Russians assumed they're going to win a blitzkrieg quick war against Ukraine. When it became clear that it wasn't, okay, plan B is not so much the brute force. They need to fall back into their cyber expertise. We could see how that strategy changed over time and how they leaned more into their cyber army as the conventional army was getting bogged down. Now, can you just distinguish between the kinds of cyber attacks that we're seeing in the UK context compared to what Ukraine is suffering in terms of cyber attacks?
Well, I think that's a very, very good point, because obviously in Ukraine, it's an all-out war. The Russians basically have taken the gloves completely off. They use things like wipers, and as the name suggests, this is a type of attack that wipes the data completely clear. That's it, it's gone forever. It's a highly aggressive attack. There were several instances of this being used against the Ukrainians. But when it comes to Britain, they're a little bit different, because Britain's a member of NATO, and the Russians are very, very conscious that certain types of cyber attack may be seen as an escalation that breaches NATO charters for military action. So what they tend to do is they attack other sectors and they use slightly less destructive methods. The two sectors they're most interested in, public administration and transport. And of course, in the past, they've even attacked the NHS. So when it comes to Ukraine, they're far more aggressive, gloves off. When they attack the UK, it's a little bit more devious. They're attacking different sections of the economy to sow discord and doubt. And then, of course, if they're ever caught, they'll claim, well, it was nothing to do with us. But of course, we know that it was.
Does Russia target all sectors of the economy equally?
No, not at all. What we tend to find is that when they're attacking different sectors, not all sectors are equal, so to speak. And so what they will do, for example, in Ukraine, is they were twice as likely to attack the media sectors as they were to attack the media sectors in Britain. Now, if you look at their invasion of Estonia in 2008, what they typically will do is they will hack newspapers to say, we want to basically stop them getting their version of events out into the media stream. And obviously, as broadcasters, you know how important it can be to get your message out. In Britain, they tend to go after transportation and they tend to go after public administration. So depending on the NATO country under attack, they attack different sectors in different areas.
Interesting. So another aspect of the report I thought was very interesting is Russian use of AI.
Yes.
Can you talk more about how they're pioneers in this area?
Well, absolutely. I think that AI is going to be something that going forward will just geometrically expand in terms of not just its military, but economic applications, both here and in Russia. One of the things that AI will do is it will allow these cyber attacks to become automated and also at greater scale. So instead of a single hacker with his hoodie on, you will get a machine learning program night and day, 24 hours churning out attacks. Furthermore, AI adapts in real time. So, for example, social media platforms say, this is bot behavior, we've detected it, we shut it down. But AI will allow it to adapt, almost a bit like a virus that's becoming immune to antibiotics. And what we're finding is that it's becoming immune quicker than you can roll out the cure. Also, as well, AI will allow for hyper-individualized attacks at scale. So they can do social media scraping, hyper-individualized attacks on individuals. An example might be someone who's a staffer in Parliament or someone who works at the Ministry of Defence. They suddenly receive a very panicked email or WhatsApp message from a relative using data that they would assume only that relative would know. They click the link and the Russians are in. And this is the sort of thing that AI is going to do. And I think that it's very, very worrying.
And have you seen evidence already that this is happening already, or is this something that we can expect in years?
We're certainly seeing AI in terms of social media disinformation. They're using deep fakes quite extensively in their war in Ukraine. We've got a paper coming out about that in the future. But basically, AI is applied to hackers. I think it's something that's being used to buttress the attack rather than be the main attack itself. Maybe in the coming years, they'll conclude that this can just self-automate and could be something that the Russians can then use even more effectively.
Now, we have a tendency, I think, in Britain and perhaps in Europe more widely to distinguish between, say, hybrid warfare and warfare, between cyber attacks and conventional kinetic warfare. Do you actually think that that dichotomy is helpful in the Russian context?
Well, not necessarily, because we in the West, we tend to think of it as binary, peace, war. In the Russian context, they don't view it so much as a binary, even the Russian language. I think the word for security or safety is bezopoznost, which literally means bez, meaning without, and opoznost, which means danger. So they don't believe in security as a standalone term, just there's an absence of danger. And in light of that sort of psychology, they regard warfare as a continuous. It's along a spectrum. It's not peace and war. It's continuous war. You just go along that spectrum and attack and provoke an enemy, depending on your diplomatic and strategic situation.
Now, just one question for me, because I know that Dom's got some as well. Does Russia target all NATO countries equally? I know we're particularly focusing on Britain just because we've got more data on that, but is it sort of that Britain is facing the same as France and Germany, or are we seeing different strategies adopted for different countries?
Well, we're seeing different strategies, and to paraphrase George Orwell, some allies are more equal than others when it comes to Russian targeting. We find, for example, countries like Slovenia and Montenegro get attacked very, very infrequently, 2 attacks over 2 years, whereas Poland, it was well over 300 attacks. The Baltic countries, Poland, Germany and France tend to get, and Britain, of course, get a lot more attention. In the Russian context, the Baltic countries are seen as very strategically important, so they're attacked more. Poland has been absolutely central in supplying aid to Ukraine, and also it's on the border of the Kaliningrad enclave, so they get attacked more. So really what Russia does, because of course they've got limited resources, they pick different sections of the economy and different countries within NATO and attack them accordingly.
Thank you. Dom, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. Michael, a couple of questions if I may. Fascinating stuff. Data is /R, to be correct, the new oil, we are told. Now, for a modern state to function efficiently, it needs uninterrupted access to and free flow of data. So how vulnerable is Russia's communications infrastructure when it comes to data, i.e. where are the data centres? I think most countries have very few, they might have millions of people connected to them, but with actual very few buildings with all the servers in them, which if they're taken offline or destroyed, they're stuffed. So where are the data centres in Russia, and how vulnerable is the Russian infrastructure?
Well, the Russian infrastructure is a lot less advanced than ours. Furthermore, in terms of where it's actually located, it's dotted throughout the country in various places, particularly the more remote regions, because obviously they're not going to advertise where these are given its strategic significance. In terms of energy, of course, Russia's got no problem with energy. They're sitting on a ton of oil. This basically allows them, like the infamous troll factory in St. Petersburg does their disinformation, and also some of the hackers like the Sandworm Collective, etc., are based in that building, or are believed to be based in that building. And we know that basically the data centers are being supplied by the fact that Russia has an abundance of energy, which of course you absolutely need for a big data center that powers AI or hacking.
Okay, and one last one. You mentioned disinformation earlier on and deep fakes. I mean, we've seen in the past when we saw the grainy images of, I mean, I'm thinking about Tiananmen Square with the chap standing in front of the tanks.
Yeah.
Because, and we believed it because it was film, it was very difficult to fabricate. Whereas now with deep fakes, it's very easy to make some very, very believable things look totally real. So my question is, as deep fakes become more sophisticated in the literal sense of the word, I mean, does it mean that it's actually, do you think it's going to take away, it's going to detract from the power of the visual? We simply cannot believe everything we see now. If we have Donald Trump standing up saying he's going to invade Greenland, we don't know if it's real or if it's deep fake. So as deep fakes get more sophisticated, does it actually mean that you need to be even more cautious about where you get your information from?
Absolutely. I think the deep fakes are going to be very, very scary. If you look at the famous Will Smith test, it's kind of like the Turing test for AI. In 2023, this very sort of distorted image of Will Smith eating spaghetti was an obvious fake. By 2025, it was almost possible to spot the fakes, and I think we're about to pass over the event horizon where you genuinely don't know the difference. And of course, talking about Russia, I can't help make an Orwell comment about you look from the pig to the man and the man to the pig and which one is which. I think we're about to cross into that world where we don't know what's real and what isn't, which is exactly what Russia wants. They want to destabilize, distrusting society. They're leveraging their cyber capacities to do that, and I think that it's going to be that much more important for mainstream outlets like the Telegraph to say, here's how you spot what's coming. I know the BBC do their Verify. I think this sort of thing is going to become much more critical going forward.
And I assume that also part of that is going to be about educating the public into how to try and spot these things. But of course, how easy is it to do that when, to Dom's point, it's so difficult to distinguish? I mean, we're in uncharted territory here, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's a Russian proverb which is trust but verify. I think we should do it the other way around and verify and then trust. Because what a lot of people do is they see something in the news and it must be true. The old generation used to say, don't believe everything on TV. I think from now on we have to not believe everything on the internet, or at very least double check it. I don't think it hurts to do that verify, then trust, rather than just trust, share and like, and possibly cause even more social media pollution.
We've talked very comprehensively about the strategies of attack. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about defence, whether it be in Britain and in Europe. How good are we, but also are there weak spots that could affect the whole of the broader alliance within Europe?
Yeah. Well, I think that the UK security forces, I think we can be very grateful for them. They do a fantastic job. The fact that we often don't hear things is proof that they're doing a great job at catching it. Unfortunately, when we talk about cybersecurity, there is such a thing as an attack surface. In other words, the more devices on a network, the more devices are vulnerable to attack. So if you're a hill sheep farmer in Cumbria, it's your cell phone, you're probably okay. If you're an NHS trust in London, well, there's hundreds and hundreds of devices and cell phones and email logins. Any mistake anywhere in that system allows the Russians in. So I think that going forward, we will need to train people to be a little bit, you sort of have their guard up a little bit, because obviously there are certain parts of NATO, and I'm saying this with a lot of respect, that maybe take cybersecurity more seriously. And I think that alliance-wide, we will need to maybe have best practice, something like the Tallinn Manual 2.0, and say, look, specifically when it comes to cyberstructure, especially critical infrastructure, because the Russians have gone after Ukraine's heating infrastructure. They've even hacked the air raid alert system to try and stop it getting out. We really, really need to protect every one of our systems in the best way that we can.
One final question from me. Have we seen examples of those kind of cyber attacks that have actually very seriously impacted, say, what would be a conventional response to a crisis? So, for example, the air raid sirens, a hospital not being able to function in Ukraine. I'm just wondering if you can give some tangible examples, or not, because perhaps it hasn't reached that point yet, where just with a flick of a switch, you're able to profoundly impact the way a country is able to react to war.
Yeah, well, I think that in terms of the examples, the most obvious one is the air raid siren system, because it's well known that Russia is actively targeting civilians. And one of the ways that it does that is it prevents them realizing an attack is coming. There's an app, if you go to Ukraine, some of you may have been, the first thing you want to do is download that app so you know where the shelters are. But if it's being hacked and compromised, then that could cause loss of life. We know there are people losing their lives all the time in Ukraine because of that. And obviously in terms of hospitals, we need to get to the wounded. And if they're locked out, people could die before they're treated.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for your time today. We'll, of course, link to that report in the show notes. Very, very interesting and covering an area we haven't talked about for a while, cyber warfare. Let's go to our final thoughts now then. Dom, where would you like to leave listeners today?
Thanks, Francis. Well, I'll just make a couple of points, if I may. Firstly, this whole changing geopolitical world and this thing that Donald Trump's going to try to put together that's going to challenge the UN. If the cover of this week's Economist doesn't have the Board of Peace, as in BORED, they are massively missing a trick. And if they do, you heard it here first. My final thought. I would just like to point folks to a brilliant podcast. There is more than one. Brilliant podcast out by the BBC at the moment called The History Bureau, and they are focusing this latest series on Putin and the apartment bombs. Now, you'll remember September 1999, just weeks after the then 46-year-old Vladimir Putin became Prime Minister, Russia's fifth Prime Minister in 18 months. 4 bombs blew up 4 apartment buildings across Russia, killing hundreds of people in their sleep. Now, the country was plunged into fear and chaos, and then a 5th bomb was found, and the suspects identified, the people that planted that bomb, eventually identified as the FSB. The FSB, first of all, denied everything, and then when they really couldn't deny it any further, they came out and said that actually they had planted it, but it was a training exercise, and they weren't explosives, it was sugar. And even though all the forensic tests had said this contains explosive, they said, no, those machines had been polluted by earlier training exercises and use in the Chechen War, etc., etc. Anyway, it's a fascinating look at the rise of Putin, because he basically, in December of that year, Yeltsin resigned on December the 31st. The Prime Minister, Putin, was made acting temporary president. He immediately launched the Second Chechen War, cemented his grip on power, etc., etc. So it's a really, really interesting documentary, 7 parts. Highly recommend The History Bureau by the BBC. I'll put a link in the episode notes.
Thanks very much, Dom. I still think it's very, very revealing of Putin's true character, that when he did that deal with Yeltsin, it was all very chummy, very friendly, and Yeltsin said, you can call me any time. Putin said, of course. Never called him again. Once he had power, never spoke to Yeltsin again. And Yeltsin felt very deeply betrayed, of course. But Putin did what he felt was necessary in order to assume power. And then as soon as he was done with you and you were no longer useful, you were discarded. And that included from former leaders as well. And I think we're seeing that, of course, in playing out in different contexts today. But Michael, thanks very much for your time today. Is there anything you'd like to leave listeners with?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We all know, for example, that Vladimir Putin is rather fond of judo and he loves to put on his gi and throw people on the mat. And it reminds me, when we talk about cyber, about Bruce Lee. And there's a famous scene from Enter the Dragon where somebody is bullying a kid, and then when Bruce Lee goes over, the bully says, so what's your style in terms of your fighting style? And Bruce Lee very coldly says, well, I like to call it the art of fighting without fighting. And then using intelligence, he manages to trap the bully and defeat him. And I think that cyber in many ways is the art of fighting without fighting. You don't fire a missile or a drone, you disable a network. But one thing about a bully is they always get their comeuppance. And if we look at the Ukrainians, I've been studying their measures against the Russians. They're absolutely magnificent. They're in the front line of this. They're starting to fight back. I think that NATO needs to lean into its Ukrainian allies and say, look, Putin may be a bully strutting around trying to throw people on the mat, but if we lean into our allies for support, he'll be the one on the mat and Ukraine is going to win this war, which they will.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your time today. Thank you, Dom. Thank you all very much for dialing in wherever you are around the world. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.